If you imagine life in rural America around 1900, you might think of horse-drawn wagons rolling slowly over dirt roads, church bells ringing across small towns, and neighbors who always seem to know each other's business. In truth, that image isn't too far off. 100 years ago, life in rural America was deliberately paced, predictable, and often constrained by community expectations. Courtship, what we might now call dating, was not an exciting game of chance, but a slow and measured process shaped by family, work, and tradition. For a young man or woman growing up in this era, the chances of meeting a future spouse were tightly linked to geography. The world was smaller for most rural Americans. A farm girl in Iowa or Kansas might grow up with the understanding that her future husband was not likely to come from a distant city, but from the next farm over, or perhaps from among the families she saw at church every Sunday. Communities were tightly woven together, and this closeness often meant that romance developed under the watchful eyes of parents, neighbors, and clergy. You, as a young person in that time, would not have had the luxury of anonymous encounters or casual flings. Courtship was purposeful. Its very structure implied marriage, and anything else would have been considered improper or even scandalous. Parents frequently played an active role in selecting or approving potential partners. In many households, especially among immigrant families holding on to traditions, a daughter's reputation was tied to the family's standing. A wrong move in romance could ripple outward, affecting siblings, parents, and extended kin. Imagine the spaces where courtship began. There were no movie theaters in the countryside until after the First World War, and automobiles were still a rarity before the 1910s. Instead, courtship unfolded in barns during dances, at church socials, at quilting bees, or on the porch swing of a farmhouse during the long summer evenings. These were not frivolous pastimes, but necessary outlets where the youth of a community could mingle. Dances, in particular, played an enormous role. A barn dance might be advertised weeks in advance, with families traveling miles by buggy just to attend. Music would be provided by fiddlers or local musicians, and the dancing was supervised carefully. A girl might be asked to dance by a boy she already knew, or, with luck, by someone slightly more mysterious, perhaps the son of a family that had recently moved into the county. But even here, the interactions were not entirely free. Parents and elders would observe closely. A dance was not only a social event, but also a display of potential matches. Another common setting was the church picnic. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of life in rural communities, and churches were the hub for both spiritual and social gathering. Sitting under the shade of oak trees, eating pies and fried chicken laid out on long tables, young people would exchange shy glances. A boy might offer to help carry a heavy basket, or perhaps he'd walk a girl to the edge of the field while keeping a safe, respectful distance. Nothing was rushed. Every word, every gesture carried a sense of weight. Historians often describe rural American courtship at this time as a ladder with clear steps. At the bottom were casual interactions, dances, picnics, conversations after church. From there, if a young man was interested, he might begin to visit a girl's home. This was no simple act. Visiting was done in the parlor, under the watchful presence of family members who often sat nearby, knitting or reading, pretending not to notice. One quaint but telling tradition was bundling, carried over from older customs. While it was more common in the 18th and 19th centuries, traces remained in certain communities in the early 20th century. Bundling allowed a courting couple to share a bed, fully clothed, sometimes even separated by a board or heavy quilt, so that they could talk late into the night under strict boundaries. For outsiders today, the practice seems odd or risky, but in communities where space was limited, it served as a controlled way for couples to build intimacy without scandal. Progression up the ladder was slow. After several visits, a boy might bring small gifts, flowers, a ribbon, or something practical like hand-stitched gloves. These gestures symbolized intent. The girl, if interested, might accept them, but her parents' opinion carried equal or greater weight. In many families, the father's approval was the true gateway to engagement. It is impossible to separate love from labor in early 20th century rural America. Courtship was not just about romance, but about survival. A man was judged not only by his charm, but by his ability to provide. Did he own land? Could he manage a farm? Was he hardworking and sober? These questions mattered more than any whispers of affection. For women, the unspoken question was whether she could manage a household. Could she cook, sew, and raise children? Could she endure the hardships of rural life, long winters, endless chores, and the monotony of isolation? A girl might be admired for her smile at a dance, but her reputation as a reliable worker often weighed more heavily in the eyes of potential in-laws. Consider this: a woman who married in 1910 might spend her entire married life without electricity, indoor plumbing, or modern conveniences. Marriage was a partnership in labor as much as in love, and everyone understood it. Despite the closeness of small communities, distance still played a role. Rural young men sometimes traveled to work in towns, or served in the military during World War I, leaving behind sweethearts. In these cases, letters became lifelines of romance. A single envelope, carefully written and delivered by train or post, carried the weight of a young man's promises and a young woman's hopes. Letters from the front during the war were filled with longing but also restraint. Soldiers rarely wrote passionately, fearing censors or breaches of propriety. Instead, they wrote about weather, food, and routine tasks, mundane details that carried hidden meanings for those waiting back home. To modern eyes, these letters might seem dull, but for couples separated by miles, they were tokens of faithfulness, small steps in the ladder of courtship when physical presence was impossible. In such tightly knit communities, gossip was both a glue and a weapon. Every budding romance was discussed, dissected, and evaluated by neighbors. If a young woman was seen too often in the company of a man, speculation would quickly spread. The community acted as both matchmaker and enforcer of norms. This constant surveillance shaped behavior. Young couples had to be careful about where they walked, how long they lingered, and even how they exchanged glances. To us, this might seem oppressive, but for them, it was simply the air they breathed. Privacy was rare, and the idea of individual romantic freedom was often outweighed by communal expectations. As the first decades of the 20th century unfolded, small but steady changes began to influence courtship rituals. The spread of automobiles, the rise of urban migration, and the impact of new technologies like the telephone would gradually alter how young men and women met and interacted. Yet, in 1900 to 1920 rural America, the old ways still held strong. Courtship was deliberate, communal, and deeply practical. And so, one must wonder, in a world where every step of romance was measured, supervised, and bound by labor, could true passion ever break free? Or did love simply reshape itself to fit the narrow channels society allowed? When the 20th century gained momentum, it quietly carried with it machines and ideas that would begin to reshape American life. At first, these changes crept into rural communities slowly, like the distant sound of a train whistle across the fields. But little. They transformed courtship, marriage, and the very definition of what love could mean. You must imagine how disorienting this was. For centuries, courtship had unfolded in predictable spaces: church socials, barn dances, the parlor under a watchful parent's eye. By the 1910s, new tools of communication and transportation began slipping into daily life: tools that allowed young people to carve out new spaces for themselves, away from constant supervision. Perhaps no invention stirred more suspicion among parents than the automobile. Before cars, a courting couple's movements were bound to the rhythms of the horse and buggy, which was slower, noisier, and harder to manage discreetly. A buggy ride was possible, but it was a public act. Everyone in town could see who was riding with whom. Then came the car. By 1910, the price of a Ford Model T had dropped enough to make ownership conceivable for young men, particularly those who worked diligently or came from families with modest prosperity. With a car, the geography of romance expanded dramatically. A young man could now pick up a girl from her home, drive her to a neighboring town, or take her down winding country roads where prying eyes could not follow. Parents, used to controlling the space of courtship, suddenly found themselves unable to track every moment. The very idea of dating as an activity, going somewhere specifically to spend private time together, emerged in part from this freedom cars provided. It is no surprise that the automobile was sometimes jokingly referred to as a chaperone killer. Ministers and community elders worried about the potential for impropriety, while young people thrilled at the sense of independence. For many, the car symbolized modernity, adventure, and the chance to choose love on one's own terms. But it also introduced new pressures. A young man without a car might feel disadvantaged compared to rivals who owned one. The car became not only a vehicle but a measure of status, ambition, and desirability. That if the car allowed couples to meet beyond watchful eyes, the telephone allowed them to whisper across distances without ever leaving home. In the early 1900s, the spread of telephone lines into rural America was uneven, but where they arrived, they reshaped courtship in subtle ways. Before, a boy might have to muster courage to visit a girl's family farm in person, passing the scrutiny of her father or mother just to exchange a few words. With the telephone, he could call her directly, bypassing the initial gauntlet of parental presence. Of course, many homes shared party lines, where multiple households used the same connection, and eavesdropping was common. Still, even with its limitations, the telephone gave couples a taste of semi-private communication. It is worth noting how mundane these conversations might sound. Young men and women didn't often declare their love directly over the line. Instead, they spoke about weather, livestock, or local events. Yet within those everyday words, a new kind of intimacy developed. A call could last 10 minutes, but it could nurture a bond that letters or chaperone visits could not replicate. Between 1917 and 1918, America's entry into World War I carried young men far from the farms and towns where they had grown up. Soldiers were shipped to training camps across the country and then sent overseas to Europe. For couples, the war introduced an abrupt kind of distance, and with it, the importance of written correspondence surged. A single letter, folded neatly into an envelope, might take weeks to cross the Atlantic. Soldiers wrote when they could, often describing camp routines, weather conditions, or the scenery of foreign lands. Censorship and propriety restrained them from speaking too openly of longing or desire. Instead, they promised to return, to marry, to resume life as it had been. For young women waiting at home, these letters became objects of daily ritual. They were read and reread, tucked away in drawers, and sometimes shown to friends or family with pride. A letter symbolized not only affection but also social proof that a young man was committed, even if absent. The war accelerated engagements and marriages. Many couples chose to wed quickly before a soldier shipped out, sealing promises with haste. Others became engaged by correspondence, relying on faith that the relationship would survive the distance. Some marriages endured, while others faltered when the realities of war and post-war adjustment brought change. By the 1920s, the very language of romance shifted. The word dating previously uncommon, began to take hold. Courtship was no longer only about measured steps toward marriage, it was becoming a more fluid process of social outings, dinners, movies, and rides. Urban life influenced this shift. Young men and women who moved to cities for work or education encountered greater anonymity and freedom. Unlike small rural towns, where every action was scrutinized, city life allowed experimentation. Couples could meet at dance halls, movie theaters, or restaurants without constant community oversight. Even rural youth absorbed these changes when they traveled or heard stories from friends. The result was a subtle tension. On one hand, families still expected marriage to be the outcome of romantic involvement. On the other hand, young people increasingly embraced the idea of courtship as leisure, as an experience in itself, not just a means to an end. Despite these changes, the weight of social expectations did not vanish. In many communities, a young woman's reputation remained fragile. Spending too much time with one man without engagement could invite gossip. Spending time with too many men could damage her standing altogether. A young man's worth continued to be measured by his ability to provide, a steady job, land ownership, or prospects for advancement. Still, the edges of tradition were softening. A girl could now claim more say in whom she accepted as a suitor. A boy could defy his parents by choosing a partner from outside his immediate circle. Love, in its quiet way, was becoming more personal and less dictated by family duty. Marriage itself remained a central goal. 100 years ago, it was almost unthinkable for young people not to marry at some point in their lives. Census records from 1900 show that the vast majority of men and women married by their late 20s. Yet the meaning of marriage was in flux. For earlier generations, marriage was primarily economic, a union of labor, land, and survival. By the 1910s and 1920s, the language of romance began to creep in more strongly. Popular magazines and advertisements emphasized companionship, emotional fulfillment, and even pleasure. Love and partnership were increasingly framed as complements, not just necessities. Still, the older mindset endured. A farmer considering marriage continued to ask whether his wife could cook, sew, and manage children. A woman continued to weigh whether a man had steady prospects. The romantic ideal coexisted uneasily with practical demands. By the end of the 1920s, the groundwork for modern dating culture had been laid. Automobiles had opened new spaces of privacy. Telephones had enabled semi-private communication. Cities had introduced anonymity and variety. And yet, rural communities clung to their traditions, balancing old expectations with new temptations. Courtship was no longer entirely predictable, but neither was it fully liberated. It hung suspended between two worlds, the quiet supervision of the parlor and the noisy freedom of the dance hall. And so we are left to wonder, in this tug-of-war between tradition and modernity, which force truly shaped the marriages that followed? Did young people bend to the weight of community, or did they, little by little, claim the right to choose love for themselves? By the time a courtship reached its natural end in early 20th century rural America, marriage was almost inevitable. Few relationships remained indefinite, and the expectation of the community leaned heavily toward formal union. For young men and women, courtship was not just about affection or leisure, it was about proving oneself fit for the responsibilities of marriage. Once a couple had reached a certain stage, the next step followed in a predictable rhythm, one that combined tradition, practicality, and community oversight. Engagements in rural America were less flashy than today. There were rarely elaborate proposals staged with rings and dramatic gestures. Instead, an engagement often grew naturally from conversations between families, quiet agreements, and the recognition that a couple had spent enough time together to warrant seriousness. A young man might approach the girl's father directly, seeking his blessing before even asking the daughter. In immigrant families, this step was especially critical, as parents expected their authority to be acknowledged. Approval was not always guaranteed. If a father doubted the young man's ability to provide, or if land, religion, or social status presented complications, an engagement could be delayed or even denied. When engagements did occur, they were marked by modest tokens. A ring was becoming common by the 1910s, often made of simple gold and sometimes featuring a small diamond as prices fell. Still, many families considered the true proof of engagement not the jewelry but the announcement at church or in the local paper. For the engaged couple, the period between promise and marriage was one of preparation. A man might work harder, save money, or finish building a small house. A woman might begin stitching linens, collecting kitchenware, and preparing for her role as homemaker. Engagement was not a pause for indulgence but a practical stage of anticipation. Weddings in rural America around 1900 to 1920 were not always grand affairs. Some were small, held in the bride's home or in the local church, attended only by family and close friends. Others became community events, with neighbors traveling long distances to celebrate. The size of the wedding often reflected the family's resources and their desire to display social standing. The ceremony itself was usually straightforward. In Protestant communities, a minister officiated with few embellishments, while Catholic, Orthodox, or immigrant groups brought their own rich traditions. For instance, German and Scandinavian families often incorporated music, food, and folk customs, while Eastern European immigrants might include blessings or symbolic rituals carried from the Old Country. One common element across communities was the wedding feast. Even families of modest means would stretch their resources to provide a celebratory meal. Tables would be filled with pies, roasted meats, and homemade preserves. In some areas, guests brought dishes to share, turning the event into a communal gathering. Music and dancing followed, echoing the very settings where courtship began. A wedding dance could last late into the night, with fiddlers playing reels and neighbors joining in the celebration. Despite the solemnity of vows, the mood was often joyous, marking not only the union of two people but also the continuation of community life. The idea of a honeymoon was spreading in the early 20th century, but in rural America it was often a modest or symbolic affair. Some couples might take a short trip to a nearby town, perhaps staying in a hotel for a night or two. Others skipped the tradition entirely, returning directly to farm work or household duties. Economic realities often dictated the choice. For farming families, a wedding might take place during the winter or early spring, when work was lighter, but even then, long absences were rarely practical. A honeymoon, if it occurred, was more about marking the transition into married life than about leisure or travel. Once the vows were exchanged, the realities of marriage began. For many, the shift was abrupt. A bride might move into her husband's family home, taking on chores under the watchful eye of a mother-in-law. Others moved into small homes or cabins the husband had built or rented, beginning the long process of establishing their own household. The division of labor was clear and demanding. Men shouldered farming, carpentry, or wage work, while women carried the endless tasks of home management, cooking, washing, sewing, and child-rearing. The introduction of electricity and plumbing into rural areas was slow, meaning that most women continued to labor without modern conveniences. Laundry, for instance, involved hauling water, heating it, scrubbing clothes by hand, and hanging them to dry, a full day's work. Marriage was not cushioned by ideals of romance alone. It was a partnership forged in necessity. Both partners were expected to contribute tirelessly to survival. A lazy or irresponsible spouse could spell disaster for the household. Yet within this framework of duty, companionship grew. Couples who had chosen each other carefully often developed strong bonds, rooted not in fleeting passion but in shared labor and endurance. The rhythm of milking cows at dawn, preparing meals, raising children, and weathering storms together created intimacy of a different kind, quiet, steady, and resilient. Marriage was also the gateway to family life. The expectation of children was nearly universal, and large families remained common in rural areas. Birth control options were limited, controversial, and often inaccessible. As a result, many couples had 6, 8, or even 10 children. Children were not only blessings but also contributors to labor. Boys worked in fields, while girls learned household tasks. Families often framed their survival strategies around the collective efforts of parents and children alike. The arrival of each new baby reshaped the household, adding to both its burdens and its sense of continuity. Still, childbirth carried risks. Maternal mortality remained high, and medical care in rural areas was often limited to midwives or traveling doctors. Marriage was thus shadowed by the knowledge that life was fragile, and each pregnancy carried uncertainty. Divorce in early 20th century rural America was rare and stigmatized. While laws permitting divorce existed, the social cost was severe. A divorced woman might find herself ostracized, while a divorced man risked losing respectability and support. In communities where reputation meant survival, the pressure to remain married was immense. This meant that even unhappy unions often endured. Couples adapted, compromised, or simply bore the weight of discontent. In some cases, extended families stepped in to mediate disputes, reinforcing the idea that marriage was not just between two people but between two networks of kin. Looking back, it is tempting to ask whether love truly flourished in such conditions. The answer depends on how one defines love. If love means passion, spontaneity, and constant affection, then perhaps many marriages fell short. But if love means endurance, partnership, and mutual reliance, then countless couples embodied it fully. Romance did not always end in grand gestures or fairy tale endings. More often, it ended in long years of shared work, quiet companionship, and the satisfaction of raising children and maintaining a household. Theirs was a love shaped not by novels or films, but by the daily grind of survival. And so, when we ask whether every love story 100 years ago ended in marriage, the answer is complicated. Many romances did end in weddings, because social and cultural structures demanded it. Marriage was the expected destination, the endpoint of courtship. But whether those marriages fulfilled the emotional longings of the heart, that is another matter. Some couples found happiness and stability. Others endured in silence. Love was real, but it was filtered through the practicalities of labor, reputation, and survival. And one is left to wonder, when the wedding dances ended, the guests went home, and the chores resumed at dawn, did the couple look at each other with joy, or simply with acceptance of the life they had chosen? When we think of marriage today, we may imagine it in terms of affection, personal compatibility, or romance. But if you step back 100 years into early 20th century America, you will quickly discover that marriage was also an economic contract. Beneath the vows and ceremonies, it was a matter of property, labor, and survival. For rural families and immigrant communities especially, marriage was not just about two people, it was about two households calculating whether a union made practical sense. By 1900, the practice of dowry, where a bride's family contributed goods, land, or money to her marriage, was fading in many parts of America. Yet among immigrant groups, the tradition held on stubbornly. Irish, Italian, German, Polish, and Eastern European families often continued to see dowries as essential. A dowry might consist of cash, livestock, furniture, or household goods. A chest filled with quilts, linens, or hand-stitched garments was a common form. In some communities, a dowry could even include farmland, passed down as part of the union. For a young woman, her dowry represented her family's effort to secure her future. For the groom, it was an incentive and a symbol of her value. But dowries also placed strain on families. Poor households might struggle to gather enough resources, delaying a daughter's marriage or limiting her options. Wealthier families, by contrast, used dowries strategically, cementing alliances with other prosperous households. In immigrant enclaves of New York, Chicago, and Boston, disputes over dowries sometimes became public scandals. Newspapers recorded cases of broken engagements where a groom demanded more than was offered, or a bride's family accused the groom of failing to honor the match after accepting goods. Behind the romantic facade, negotiations of wealth simmered. In rural America, land often replaced dowries as the core of marital economics. A father might gift his son a parcel of farmland upon marriage, or he might allow a newlywed couple to build a cabin on his property. For daughters, land inheritance was less common, but marriage could still hinge on access to acreage. In farming regions, a young man's suitability was often measured by whether he had secured land of his own. Without it, his ability to support a wife and children was uncertain. Renting land was possible, but ownership was the true badge of adulthood and respectability. Census records from the early 1900s reveal the centrality of land to marriage. Men who owned farms were more likely to marry earlier, while landless laborers often delayed or married later. A woman marrying into a landowning family could expect greater stability, while one marrying a tenant farmer faced harder labor and greater insecurity. It is striking how deeply survival was tied to soil. Marriage, for many, was a way of securing a foothold in the land itself, a foothold that could mean the difference between prosperity and hardship. While land and dowries were visible, household labor was the hidden engine of marital economics. A wife's capacity to work was as valuable as any property she brought into marriage. A bride was often judged on her hope chest, a collection of linens, towels, and clothing she had prepared in anticipation of marriage. This was not only a symbol of her industriousness but also a practical necessity. Once married, her duties multiplied, cooking for a large family, preserving food for winter, making soap, sewing clothes, and managing the relentless cycle of laundry. Historians estimate that women in rural households worked an average of 60 to 70 hours per week. Their labor was unpaid, yet it formed the foundation of survival. Marriage, therefore, was not a retreat into leisure but an entry into ceaseless responsibility. Even in urban working-class households, where women sometimes held wage-paying jobs in factories or as domestic servants, the expectation remained that marriage would pull them back into unpaid domestic work. A wife's labor saved the household money, which was as important as a husband's wages. Toc marriage as purely romantic in 1900 is to miss its strategic role. Families calculated. Parents asked, could this union ensure survival? Would their daughter be safe, fed, and housed? Would their son have help in sustaining the farm or household? Sometimes, marriages bridged gaps between families with different resources, one contributing land, the other contributing labor or goods. Other times, marriages reinforced economic patterns, uniting prosperous households to consolidate wealth. Even among couples who loved each other deeply, the economic undercurrent could not be ignored. A farmer might adore his sweetheart, but if her dowry was too small or her family's reputation too poor, obstacles could arise. Similarly, a young woman might care for a suitor, but if he lacked steady prospects, her parents might refuse consent. Not all engagements led to marriage. Financial hardship could unravel plans. The Panic of 1907, for example, caused many young men to delay marriage until economic conditions improved. Families who had promised dowries sometimes failed to deliver, leading to disputes and even lawsuits. In some cases, broken engagements became public spectacles. Newspapers occasionally reported court cases where one party sued the other for breach of promise, claiming damages for the financial and emotional harm caused by a broken betrothal. These cases reveal just how intertwined money and love were, even in supposedly private matters. For many young Americans, marriage was not simply a choice between two people but a decision that carried the weight of family duty. Even those who dreamed of romance understood that love had to bend to economics. Parents reminded daughters that affection was secondary to security. Sons were taught that a household was a financial burden they must be ready to shoulder. This did not mean love was absent. Rather, love was expected to grow within the framework of economic necessity. Couples entered marriage not only with hopes of affection but also with a sober awareness that survival depended on shared labor. Marriage in early 20th century America did not end with vows, it began with arithmetic. Once the ceremony was complete, a household became an economic engine, with income, expenses, and labor carefully measured against the narrow margins of survival. For most families, life was not a pursuit of wealth but a daily calculation of enough. By 1910, industrial America had produced a vast working class. Immigrant families in New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh crowded into small apartments, often with 3 or more children. Wages for a male laborer might average $12.15 a week, with little stability. Out of that meager sum, rent consumed a third, food half, and the remainder had to stretch to cover clothing, coal, soap, and doctor's bills. Studies conducted by reformers like Jane Addams and the settlement house workers revealed the harsh mathematics of marriage. One survey of immigrant families in Chicago found that almost every household ran a deficit, meaning the husband's wages were not enough. The difference was made up by wives and children taking in laundry, sewing, or day work. Sometimes boarders were crammed into already small apartments to bring in extra income. Marriage, then, was not simply companionship, it was a partnership in economic desperation. A wife's thrift determined whether the household survived the winter. Food was the largest expense, and the kitchen was its command center. Housewives stretched every penny, buying day-old bread, soup bones, or bruised vegetables. In immigrant neighborhoods, women often relied on ethnic food traditions to make cheap staples palatable. Italians turned tomatoes and flour into filling pasta dishes, Jewish families stretched fish into gefilte or potatoes into kugel, Polish mothers transformed cabbage into soups that could last several meals. Cookbooks of the period reveal the marriage between economy and nutrition. Titles like the Settlement Cookbook, The Way to a Man's Heart, 1901, combined recipes with practical advice on thrift. One entry suggested boiling a chicken 3 times, once for soup, once for meat, and finally for scraps. Nothing was wasted. A wife's skill in this sphere determined the health and happiness of the family. Men might earn the wages, but women's management of the kitchen often meant the difference between hunger and comfort. Clothing was another hidden cost. Factory workers needed boots and durable garments. Children outgrew outfits quickly, and store-bought clothes were expensive. Wives often sewed late into the night, patching shirts and turning dresses inside out to give them a new look. The sewing machine, once a luxury, became an essential household tool by the early 1900s. Advertisements promised it would save a marriage by reducing expenses. But even with such tools, the labor was immense. Many mothers kept trunks of hand-me-down garments, passing clothing from one child to the next until fabric disintegrated. In wealthier homes, this burden was shifted onto hired seamstresses or laundresses, but for the working poor, it remained the unpaid labor of wives. Beyond cooking and sewing, the wife often acted as the household accountant. She managed the weekly budget, paid rent, and kept track of debts at local grocers. Credit was common. Storekeepers allowed families to, by now, pay later, with the understanding that wages would settle the account. Many women maintained notebooks of expenses, balancing pennies with meticulous care. Reformers who studied these records were often astonished at the ingenuity of poor housewives. They managed scarcity with precision, juggling debts and purchases to keep their families afloat, and yet, despite this essential role, the wife's labor was often invisible in public records. Census forms listed her as housewife, a term that concealed her role as economist, laborer, and provider. Marriage economics also extended to children. In working-class families, children were not only mouths to feed but also future contributors. By age 10 or 12, many were expected to help, delivering newspapers, selling goods on the street, or working in textile mills. Laws limiting child labor existed but were poorly enforced until after 1916. Parents often justified early marriages of daughters as economic relief. A married daughter meant one less mouth to feed, and possibly a dowry or bride price coming in. Sons were urged to marry only once they could contribute stably to the family income. Thus, even marriage decisions were entangled with children's economic roles. For middle and upper-class couples, the economics of marriage looked different. A lawyer's or doctor's income could support a household without wives needing to labor outside. Here, the measure of a wife's skill lay in managing servants, organizing social obligations, and ensuring the family's public respectability. But even in these households, women were judged by their ability to avoid waste. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal offered endless advice on efficiency and thrift, reinforcing the notion that a good wife was, above all, a wise manager of her husband's income. Thus, whether in a cramped tenement or a spacious parlor, the economics of marriage demanded constant vigilance. Marriage under these conditions carried strain. Men felt pressure to earn steadily, women bore the invisible burden of stretching resources. Arguments over money were common, sometimes leading to broken households or abandonment. Newspapers of the era contained countless small notices of husbands deserting wives, often citing financial stress. Yet, many couples persevered, binding themselves together through hardship. Love may have begun the marriage, but survival tested it daily. Couples who endured often developed deep bonds forged in shared struggle. Looking back, one cannot help but ask, was marriage in early 20th century America truly a union of equals, or was it a bargain struck on unequal terms, men measured by wages, women by invisible labor? The answer, perhaps, lies in the countless silent stories of kitchens, sewing rooms, and rented tenements where love persisted against arithmetic. By the early decades of the 20th century, marriage in America was not only a private matter, it was becoming a public concern. Governments, reformers, churches, and women's organizations all debated how households should function, what roles husbands and wives ought to play, and how economic hardship strained or reshaped those roles. The seemingly boring details of rent, wages, and budgets fed directly into some of the century's most important social reforms. America's vast immigrant influx, Italians, Poles, Irish, Jews, and others, made the marriage economy even more visible. Families arriving with little often relied on kinship networks, pooling wages to secure housing and arrange marriages within their ethnic communities. Marriage was sometimes less about personal choice and more about survival within a new land. A daughter might be encouraged to marry someone from the same village or parish, ensuring cultural continuity and mutual aid. Sons were pressed to contribute wages before they could marry. Settlement houses and social workers noticed that immigrant women often resisted Americanization efforts that encouraged them to adopt middle-class domestic ideals. Why? Because those ideals assumed a single breadwinner and a non-working wife, an arrangement impossible for most. Many immigrant wives continued to earn income, whether by running boarding houses, selling goods, or sewing. Their marriages functioned under dual systems: cultural tradition and economic necessity. Industrial jobs expanded opportunities for women, especially in textile mills, garment shops, and offices. Young women often worked before marriage, saving small dowries or contributing to family rent. Marriage usually ended these careers, but by the 1910s and 1920s, more married women began re-entering the labor force. This shift unsettled traditional norms. Employers hesitated to hire married women, fearing divided loyalties, while reformers argued that a good wife belonged at home. Yet families themselves often ignored such moralizing, because two incomes meant survival. Newspapers occasionally mocked the working wife, but her presence grew steadily. By 1930, nearly 12% of married women were in the labor force, a number that would only rise as the century progressed. The economics of marriage was no longer just about invisible domestic labor, it increasingly involved visible, paid labor too. As women fought for the right to vote, the debate often returned to marriage. Opponents of suffrage claimed political power would unsettle the home, undermining wifely devotion and upsetting the balance of economic dependence. Suffragists countered that women's invisible labor already sustained households and communities, and political recognition was a natural extension of their responsibilities. Marriage thus became a rhetorical battleground. Campaign posters argued that giving women the vote would create stronger, more moral families. Others warned it would produce neglectful wives and emasculated husbands. When suffrage was finally won in 1920, it did not erase the economic inequality of marriage, but it shifted the cultural expectation: women could be citizens and wives at once, not merely dependents. As marriage economics grew more complex, divorce slowly increased. In 1900, divorce rates in America were around 7 per 1,000 married couples. By 1920, that number had nearly doubled. Financial strain was a common cause, but so too was the growing recognition that women could leave unhappy marriages. Courts often favored men, particularly when children or property were involved. Yet newspapers began to feature stories of women petitioning for divorce, sometimes on grounds of desertion or cruelty tied to money disputes. Reformers debated whether rising divorce rates signaled moral decline or simply a recognition that unequal marriages were unsustainable. Even when couples stayed together, economic friction left marks. Letters, diaries, and oral histories reveal a recurring refrain: "We made do." That phrase carried both pride and exhaustion, a testament to resilience but also to strain. Progressive reformers saw the struggles of married families as social problems requiring intervention. They lobbied for better wages, child labor laws, rent control, and public health programs, all justified as protecting the family unit. Magazines ran articles like, "How much does it cost to keep a wife?" or "The Science of Household Management." Universities even introduced home economics as a field of study, elevating domestic management into a discipline. The goal was not just to teach thrift but to professionalize women's role in sustaining the marriage economy. Yet, while reform helped, it also reinforced the idea that marriage was an institution best measured in economic efficiency rather than affection. Love was still there, but survival always overshadowed it. By the 1930s, America entered the Great Depression, and the marriage economy faced its greatest test. Couples postponed weddings for lack of money, women returned to work in greater numbers, and families took in relatives to share expenses. Marriage became less about dowries and more about pooling survival resources. Marriage may have been the economic foundation of society 100 years ago, but it always began with a meeting. Before vows, budgets, and households, there was the delicate, rule-laden process of courtship. In early 20th century America, how two people came together was less about spontaneity and more about custom, geography, and the watchful eyes of family and community. Today, dating is often thought of as a private matter, guided by individual choice. In 1900s America, however, courtship was a public institution. Families, churches, and neighborhoods all shaped who met whom, under what circumstances, and with what intentions. Courtship was not simply romance, it was a pathway to marriage. Casual relationships carried social risks, particularly for women. The expectation was clear: if a man showed repeated attention, it signaled serious intent. If he did not, gossip followed swiftly. Thus, every introduction, every parlor visit, every shared walk had meaning. Courtship was both tender and tactical, a dance between desire and duty. The settings of first meetings varied across class and region. Church and social clubs: for many, the church was the central hub of community life. Sunday services, choir rehearsals, and church picnics provided opportunities for young men and women to notice one another. Social clubs, ethnic societies, temperance leagues, or fraternal organizations, offered similar spaces. Neighborhood gatherings: in small towns, young people often met at barn dances, fairs, or holiday gatherings. A shared dance might be enough to begin a courtship, though it always occurred under the eyes of elders. Workplaces: in industrial cities, factories and offices brought men and women into proximity. Many marriages began on the shop floor, despite employers often frowning upon fraternization. Urban leisure spaces: by the 1910s, amusement parks, movie theaters, and dance halls became popular meeting places. Reformers worried these new spaces offered too much freedom, away from parental supervision, but for young people, they were thrilling venues for connection. Each setting carried its own codes of behavior, and each shaped the kind of marriage that might result. The domestic parlor, with its stiff chairs and family portraits, was the heart of courtship rituals. If a man was interested in a young woman, he visited her home, often on a Sunday afternoon. The family sat nearby, sometimes in the same room, listening as the couple conversed. Privacy was minimal. This practice reinforced the seriousness of courtship. It was not only the girl being courted, but her entire family. Parents assessed the suitor's manners, prospects, and intentions. A young man's reputation followed him into the parlor, and missteps could close the door permanently. For couples, this meant finding intimacy within surveillance. A glance, a shared laugh, a whispered remark carried more weight because it had to slip through layers of propriety. Courtship was marked by small exchanges. A young man might bring flowers, candy, or, if serious, a piece of jewelry. A photograph, given or received, symbolized attachment. Handwritten letters played an enormous role, especially in long-distance relationships. Many couples cherished these tokens for life, tucking them into drawers or albums. They were the quiet evidence of affection, often preserved even after marriages ended or partners passed away. Courtship carried its own vocabulary. A man who called regularly was a steady. A couple was said to be keeping company. Engagement often followed months, sometimes years, of this steady companionship. But the rules were uneven. Men could afford to be casual longer, women risked reputation if seen as forward or too available. A woman's virtue, both real and perceived, was central to her marriage prospects. Thus, even the smallest missteps in courtship, an unsupervised outing, a too familiar gesture, could damage her chances. Not all courtships were equal. Social barriers shaped possibilities. Wealthier families often discouraged matches with working-class suitors, while immigrants frequently preferred their children to marry within their ethnic community. Newspapers occasionally reported on scandalous marriages that crossed these lines, especially when love defied parental wishes. Such stories fascinated readers because they highlighted the tension between individual choice and social expectation. For most couples, however, the safe path was within familiar boundaries. Courtship reinforced social order as much as it kindled romance. Courtship in early 20th century America was not the headlong rush of modern dating. It was a slow, cautious process, layered with rules, rituals, and watchfulness. Every word and gesture mattered. And yet, within those constraints, love found its way. Couples who began in parlors or at church socials sometimes built enduring partnerships, weathering the economic and social storms that followed. But this raises a question: in a world where courtship was so tightly managed by family and community, how much room was there for genuine choice, for affection to triumph over duty? Courtship in early 20th century America was a delicate balance between tradition and change. If the first step was the meeting, the second was a structured series of gestures, visits, and rituals that moved a couple from curiosity toward commitment. What today might be called dating was then a formal, rule-bound progression that involved not only the couple but their families and communities. For middle and upper-class families, introductions often began with the exchange of calling cards. A young man left his card with the family of the young woman, signaling his interest. If the card was returned or if an invitation followed, the courtship was permitted to proceed. If not, the silence spoke volumes. In working-class families, where formality was less pronounced, introductions often came through neighbors, church gatherings, or mutual acquaintances. But even here, a suitor was expected to show respect by calling at the family home, announcing himself properly, and earning approval from parents before any further steps. The first visit was less about romance and more about respectability. A young man's posture, language, and even his clothes were examined as signs of his character. Once interest was established, letters often carried the weight of courtship, especially when couples lived apart or worked long hours. These letters reveal both tenderness and restraint. Men expressed admiration, devotion, and hope for the future. Women often replied with cautious warmth, careful never to appear too eager. The language was polite but laden with coded meaning. A phrase like, "I think of you often," could be the equivalent of today's declaration of love. Letters were cherished, reread, and guarded, sometimes hidden from parental eyes if families disapproved of the match. Historians studying courtship letters find them filled with a mixture of mundane detail, work schedules, weather, church news, and deep emotion. This blend reflects the reality of love in an era when life was bound by duty. Courtship rarely unfolded in complete privacy. Outings to church picnics, concerts, or fairs were common, but almost always under the supervision of a chaperone. A younger sibling, a cousin, or even the girl's mother might accompany the pair. The purpose was not only propriety but protection of reputation. A young woman seen too often in public without supervision risked gossip. For men, the presence of a chaperone was a reminder that their intentions were being monitored. Yet within this surveillance, couples found ways to express affection: a shared look at a bandstand, whispered words during a stroll, or a hand briefly touched beneath a picnic blanket. These small rebellions carried enormous emotional weight. By the 1910s, urban life introduced new spaces for courtship: dance halls, amusement parks, and movie theaters. Reformers worried that these places allowed too much freedom, but for many working-class couples, they were affordable and exciting escapes. A nickel bought a dance or a silent film ticket. Young people mingled beyond the watch of family, choosing partners by attraction rather than parental arrangement. This was the beginning of modern dating culture, though it coexisted uneasily with older traditions of parlor visits and family approval. For many young women, these outings offered a taste of autonomy, though still shadowed by social judgment. A girl who frequented dance halls too often risked being labeled fast. Still, the appeal of these new leisure spaces reshaped how courtship unfolded. As relationships deepened, tokens of affection became central. Flowers and sweets were common early gifts, but jewelry marked seriousness. A man who presented a locket, brooch, or bracelet was signaling deeper intent. The ultimate token was the engagement ring, which by the 1920s had become nearly universal. Jewelers promoted diamonds as symbols of eternal love, a trend fueled by aggressive marketing campaigns. For working-class men, even a modest ring represented weeks of wages, a tangible sacrifice demonstrating commitment. Women, in turn, might give men items such as handkerchiefs, embroidered gifts, or photographs. These small tokens carried personal meaning and often became treasured keepsakes for decades. Courtship was never entirely private. Neighbors noticed visits, churchgoers observed who walked home together, and families traded quiet comments about suitors. Approval, or disapproval, of a match circulated quickly through these channels. For couples, this meant that every step was performed in a semi-public arena. Courtship was not simply about two people learning to love each other, it was about two families, two reputations, and often two communities aligning. Once a couple reached understanding, the engagement was announced. Often with a formal gathering. Newspapers printed engagement notices, especially in small towns, turning private love into public fact. The engagement period could last months or even years, depending on finances. Couples saved money, purchased furniture, and prepared for marriage. For many women, the engagement was the first socially acceptable moment to begin preparing a hope chest of linens and household goods. Breaking an engagement carried stigma, especially for women, though it did happen. Lawsuits for breach of promise were not uncommon, with women suing men who abandoned engagements, citing damage to reputation and lost prospects. Courtship was thus a carefully measured dance. Each step, calling, writing, visiting, outing, gifting, engaging, was imbued with meaning. Love could blossom, but always within boundaries. And yet, these rituals carried contradictions. They were designed to ensure respectability and stability, but they also allowed for subtle defiance, late-night letters, stolen moments, daring outings to a dance hall. Which raises a lingering question: in a world so bound by propriety and oversight, did these small rebellions of courtship carry more intensity than modern, freer expressions of love? As we move further into the landscape of early 20th century America, the story of love and marriage becomes less about the spark of courtship and more about the quieter, longer rhythms of life after vows were exchanged. This was the moment when young couples, often bound by community expectations and family arrangements, shifted from the anticipation of engagement to the lived reality of shared responsibility. In many cases, it was the transition from the dances and social evenings filled with promise into kitchens with unpolished floors, fields demanding daily labor, and family obligations that rarely allowed for a pause. Marriage, in the America of 100 years ago, was rarely framed in terms of individual fulfillment in the way it often is today. Instead, it was presented as a social contract, a union that contributed to the stability of families, communities, and even the nation itself. When you examine diaries and letters of women from small Midwestern towns in the 1920s, you notice a tone that is steady, almost resigned, and often focused more on managing resources than on the romance of partnership. For example, a bride in Iowa might describe the careful planning of a week's meals, or how she learned to mend socks efficiently, rather than writing at length about her feelings toward her husband. This shift was not necessarily one of disappointment, but it reveals that the concept of love was often subsumed beneath the obligations of household labor and survival. It is important to understand that in the early decades of the 20th century, the very definition of marriage was closely tied to work. Husbands were expected to provide through farming, industrial labor, or professional work if they were fortunate enough to be educated. Wives, in turn, were expected to manage the home, rear children, and ensure that the household ran smoothly. These gendered divisions of labor, though sometimes rigid, were rarely questioned in ordinary communities. A woman's success was measured not in personal ambitions but in the cleanliness of her home, the health of her children, and her ability to stretch a husband's paycheck through thrift and careful budgeting. Dowries and inheritance arrangements played less of a role in America compared to Europe, yet the financial foundation of a marriage still carried weight. A man was often expected to show that he could afford a small home or at least the promise of stable wages before being considered a suitable partner. Families watched closely, not only to assess a young man's character but to ensure that he had the means to support a daughter. A century ago, love without means was a fragile arrangement, one that communities often discouraged. This explains why some couple, deeply affectionate during their courtship, drifted apart when the economic realities of marriage proved insurmountable. For women, the act of marrying did not simply mean entering into a partnership, it meant leaving behind the identity of daughter and becoming a wife. In rural areas, this transition was marked by a practical loss of independence. A woman might move far from her parents' farm to join her husband's family, carrying with her the knowledge that her new role was defined by obedience, industry, and fertility. In towns and cities, the expectations were similar, though shaped by different surroundings. A city wife might navigate small apartments, factory schedules, and bustling neighborhoods rather than fields and barns, but her work was no less consuming. Marriage also intersected with religious expectations. Churches, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, played a central role in guiding couples toward what was deemed a proper union. Sermons often reinforced the idea that marriage was sacred and indissoluble, a covenant that demanded patience, forgiveness, and endurance. Divorce, while legally possible, carried significant stigma, and many couples endured unhappy marriages rather than face the shame of separation. Court records from the 1910s and 1920s reveal divorces based on abandonment, cruelty, or failure to provide, but these were exceptions rather than norms. For the majority, marriage meant persistence, regardless of the personal sacrifices involved. The children born into these marriages were often viewed as the ultimate fulfillment of the union. Family size varied, but in farming communities it was common for couples to have large families, both because children were seen as blessings and because they were practical contributors to the labor of the household. Infant mortality remained a harsh reality, however, and many mothers endured the quiet grief of losing children in the first years of life. Love, in such contexts, became less of a personal romance and more of a collective endurance, the bond that held together families through cycles of birth, loss, and survival. This is not to say that affection vanished from marriages after vows were spoken. Love letters written between spouses during wartime, for example, reveal deep tenderness and longing. Husbands stationed overseas in World War I often wrote to their wives with language that combined devotion with practical instruction, promises of return, requests for news of crops or finances, reassurances of love mingled with reminders of responsibility. The blending of emotion and duty was typical of marriages during this period, where the personal and the practical were rarely separate. Cultural shifts in the 1920s and 1930s began to reshape the narrative slightly. With the rise of popular magazines, cinema, and radio, new ideas about romance began to filter into public consciousness. Hollywood films depicted love as passionate, dramatic, and central to life's purpose, creating a contrast with the quieter, obligation-heavy marriages that most people lived. This divergence between the cultural image of love and the reality of married life began to grow, planting the seeds of expectations that would expand further in later decades. Still, for the majority of Americans 100 years ago, the story of love reached its most significant conclusion not at the altar but in the decades that followed, through the raising of families, the building of homes, and the weaving of small, ordinary lives into the fabric of their communities. While today it is tempting to imagine every romance of that era ending in a wedding, the truth is more nuanced. Some love stories dissolved under the strain of economic hardship. Others transformed into enduring partnerships that balanced duty with affection. And still others faded quietly, remembered only in a diary entry, a faded photograph, or a letter never sent. The question that lingers is whether these marriages, rooted in community expectation and economic necessity, were truly the happy endings their era claimed them to be, or if they were simply the beginnings of lives where love had to adapt, compromise, and sometimes disappear into routine.